Have you ever felt the laughter of your own flesh and blood slice through your chest like broken glass? We are taught family is our safest harbor, yet sometimes it becomes the stage for brutal betrayals wrapped in glamorous wedding gowns. Brace yourself. This is not just a cruel joke at a lavish wedding, but a cold-blooded revenge executed by my 9-year-old son, who destroyed an empire of lies in exactly 2 minutes. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now let's begin the story. My name is Maya Stone. Silverbell Manor was a fortress of extreme wealth. An intimidating, sprawling estate built to remind ordinary people exactly where they stood in the grand hierarchy of life. Tonight it served as the battleground for my total humiliation. The grand ballroom was a masterpiece of opulence. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a cold, brilliant light over the sea of high society elites mingling below. The air was thick and suffocating, smelling heavily of roasted duck vintage champagne and the dizzying scent of imported white roses. I sat trapped at table 42, a tiny wobbly circle shoved into the darkest, most undesirable corner of the room, positioned right next to the swinging kitchen doors. Every time a server rushed past, a blast of greasy heat washed over me, a cruel physical reminder of my outcast status at my own brother's wedding. Up on the grand elevated stage, surrounded by towering floral arrangements, stood Chloe. She was the bride, practically glowing inside a custom designer wedding gown stitched with real pearls that cost more than I could earn in 10 lifetimes. To the oblivious crowd, she was the very picture of high society elegance, a flawless heiress, stepping into a perfect fairy tale with my brother Ethan. But from my shadowy corner, I could clearly see the predatory, vicious gleam in her eyes. She held the microphone loosely in her perfectly manicured hand, tapping the silver mesh gently. A heavy, dead silence washed over the room, a collective holding of breath that felt entirely malicious. Chloe's gaze swept slowly across the massive room. She deliberately looked past the tables filled with influential politicians, wealthy corporate executives, and prominent socialites. Her eyes tracked like a sniper seeking a target until they locked dead onto me. Her lips stretched into a wide, venomous smirk. "You know, weddings are a beautiful time to bring absolutely everyone together," Chloe announced. Her voice boomed through the massive speakers, dripping with a sickeningly sweet sarcasm that coated the room like poison. "We even made sure to be deeply charitable and include those who might never otherwise get to experience a slice of true luxury. Ladies and gentlemen, please direct your attention to the back and give a warm round of applause to our very own charity case, Ethan's sister Maya. She is our highly special guest who brought her official poverty certificate just to score a free hot meal from us tonight." A collective gasp rippled through the hundreds of guests. For one fleeting second, I prayed it was a gasp of outrage on my behalf. But that desperate hope died instantly, as the gasp dissolved into a chorus of low, mocking snickers. The sound was like a swarm of hornets buzzing right against my eardrums. My breath hitched sharply in my throat. I stared straight ahead, my vision suddenly swimming. Chloe paced the stage with the slow, arrogant swagger of a predator playing with its dying food. She brought the microphone closer to her mouth. We really must admire her desperate hustle, though. Working a dead-end entry-level administrative job at EtherCore Dynamics, spending her entire life filing meaningless papers for minimum wage, and still managing to show up here as a spectacular breathing example of a completely failed single mother. It truly takes a staggering amount of shameless bravery to step your cheap shoes into a room like this when you clearly know you do not belong among us. The cruelty of her words hit me like physical blows to the chest, punching the oxygen straight out of my lungs. But the true agonizing devastation did not come from the bride. It came from the VIP table, situated right beside the stage. Above the murmurs of the wealthy crowd, I heard a sharp, familiar barking laugh. It was Eleanor. my own flesh and blood, my mother. Instead of rising up in righteous fury to defend her daughter, Eleanor was chuckling. Her heavy diamond necklace caught the stage lights as she threw her head back, actively nodding in agreement with Chloe's vicious roast. Just 2 hours earlier, standing in the grand marble foyer, my mother had looked me up and down with raw disgust. She had loudly announced to a group of Chloe's wealthy relatives that my clearance rack evening gown looked like it had been hastily sewn together from cheap motel curtains. The memory of her sneering face burned fiercely in my mind, multiplying the agony of this public execution by 1,000. The grand ballroom began to compress around me. The clinking of expensive crystal glasses and the soft jazz melodies from the live orchestra faded into a sharp, high-pitched ringing inside my head. I was entirely paralyzed. A scorching flush surged up my throat and engulfed my face, staining my cheeks with the fiery crimson of sheer humiliation. Concealed beneath the thick linen tablecloth, hidden from the scrutinizing eyes of the onlookers, my hands were locked together with such intense pressure that my knuckles gleamed bone-white. I balled my hands into tight fists, viciously driving my bare fingernails deep into the flesh of my palms. I forced them down with increasing severity, craving the physical hurt. The piercing, warm, sticky drop of blood slid down the crease of my palm, soaking silently into my cheap dress. Then, heated viscous bead of blood tracing the lines of my palm, quietly absorbing into my inexpensive gown. Breaking down crying like a pathetic victim was exactly the prize they all wanted. Right beside me, my wooden chair creaked. My son Leo, who was only 9 years old, had completely stopped eating. His small silver fork slipped from his fingers and clattered loudly against the china dessert plate. He did not care about the noise he made. He shifted his small body in his chair, turning completely toward me, utterly oblivious to the whispering, sneering aristocrats surrounding our table. Leo tilted his head up. His big, innocent brown eyes were wide open, filled with a deep, swirling confusion and a quiet, profound sadness. He looked up at the brightly lit stage where Chloe stood triumphant, then glanced over at his grandmother, who was still wiping a tear of laughter from her eye, and finally he looked back at my trembling face. Slowly he reached out his small, warm hand and placed it gently over my clenched, bleeding fists under the table. "Mommy," Leo whispered softly, yet his gentle, childish voice managed to slice cleanly through the deafening, roaring noise of panic inside my head. "Why are they being so mean to you?" That single, pure, devastating question struck my chest like a wrecking ball. It shattered the very last fragile wall of my endurance, crushing the final ounce of strength I possessed. I stared into the innocent, wide eyes of my little boy, entirely incapable of forming a coherent answer. How do you explain the brutal mathematics of family betrayal to a 9-year-old child? To understand the sheer magnitude of the knife currently twisting in my back, you have to understand what my brother and I used to be. Decades before this suffocating room of crystal chandeliers and imported roses existed, Ethan and I were a unified front against a cruel world. When our father abandoned us, taking every last penny and leaving behind a terrifying mountain of gambling debts, I did not hesitate. I stepped between my family and utter ruin. I permanently closed my college textbooks. I took on 3 grueling jobs, working over 18 hours a day. I spent my early 20s inhaling toxic fumes in a damp laundromat at dawn, scrubbing the muddy floors of corporate offices in the afternoon, and staring at blinding computer screens, doing data entry until 2 in the morning. Every single dollar I bled for went directly into an envelope marked for Ethan's future. I paid his university tuition in full. I bought the crisp black suit he wore to his graduation. I vividly remember the day he received his diploma. He gripped my scarred, chemical-burned hands, tears welling in his eyes, and promised me firmly, "I will never forget this, Maya. We are a team forever." Forever, it turned out, came with an expiration date. And that date arrived the exact second Chloe sauntered into his life. She was a masterclass in calculated perfection, a living, breathing illusion of high society grace. She claimed to be the sole heir to a massive international shipping conglomerate, a girl who possessed unimaginable wealth, but just wanted to settle down with a simple, brilliant man like my brother. It was an intoxicating fantasy, and Ethan swallowed it whole. Chloe used her supposedly bottomless bank accounts to completely rewrite his reality. She bought him luxury watches that cost more than my annual salary. She paraded him through exclusive galas and five-star resorts, slowly and methodically scrubbing away his working-class roots until he felt deeply ashamed of where he came from. More importantly, she made him ashamed of me. I saw through her glittering disguise, almost immediately recognizing the classic textbook maneuvers of a psychological manipulator. Chloe was a virtuoso at gaslighting. In front of Ethan, she played the role of the sweet, accommodating future sister-in-law, always offering a painfully fake smile. But the moment his back was turned, she struck with the precision of a viper. She would orchestrate humiliating scenarios like deliberately giving me the wrong address for a fancy family dinner, then performing a theatrical display of disappointment when I arrived an hour late, breathless and panicked. "Oh, Maya, you are always so terribly disorganized. It really reflects poorly on Ethan." She would sigh loud enough for his wealthy new friends to hear. She systematically built an invisible wall around my brother, convincing him that my financial struggles were a symptom of inherent laziness. She painted me as a toxic, depressing anchor, trying to drag him down from his shiny new pedestal. If Ethan's defection was a quiet tragedy, my mother's betrayal was a loud, grotesque comedy. Eleanor had spent her entire adult life bitterly resenting her lack of wealth. When Chloe dropped a limited edition designer handbag onto our scratched kitchen table during her first visit, my mother essentially fell to her knees in pure worship. Decades of my silent, agonizing sacrifices evaporated in the blink of an eye. The thousands of hours I spent breaking my back to keep the electricity running and food in Eleanor's mouth meant absolutely nothing compared to the proximity of fake royalty. To my mother, I was instantly demoted to a tedious, embarrassing roommate. She idolized Chloe, aggressively adopting the young woman's snobbish mannerisms and defending her every cruelty. Eleanor gladly threw her own daughter under the bus just for the privilege of bragging to her friends about her billionaire future daughter-in-law. Despite the overwhelming toxicity, I tried to swallow my pride. I recalled the bitter, freezing cold of a Tuesday evening just 3 weeks prior to this nightmare. I had stood under the flickering fluorescent lights of a cheap discount store, carefully counting a small stack of crumpled $1 bills. I had skipped my lunch break for 2 solid months to save up $55 just to buy Leo a decent dark blue suit for this exact wedding. As I stood in that depressing checkout line, my intuition was screaming at maximum volume. A heavy, dark feeling settled in my stomach, warning me that Chloe was a fraud. Real opulence does not need to broadcast its power by stepping on the necks of exhausted single mothers. I felt it deep in my bones that beneath the layers of imported silk and diamond jewelry, Chloe was hiding a filthy, catastrophic secret. Yet I had stubbornly ignored my own instincts. I had looked at the little blue suit in my hands and made a solemn vow to endure the disrespect. I told myself I would sit quietly in the darkest corner of the reception, paste a polite smile on my face, and applaud my brother's joy. I was fully prepared to absorb every insult if it meant Ethan got his happily ever after. But as the agonizing seconds ticked by in the grand ballroom, that noble sacrifice turned to bitter ash in my mouth. I forced my eyes away from Chloe's gloating face on the stage and looked toward the center of the room. I looked at the VIP head table. There sat Ethan, the fragile boy I had shielded from the world. The man whose entire existence was built on the foundation of my destroyed youth. He was sitting less than 20 feet away in a custom tuxedo I could never afford. He did not leap from his chair in a righteous rage. He did not march onto the stage to snatch the microphone from his cruel wife. He did nothing. Ethan was staring intently at his expensive silver dinner plate, his shoulders hunched in an ugly display of supreme cowardice. He refused to look up. He refused to meet my desperate gaze. He sat completely paralyzed, allowing the woman he supposedly loved to publicly butcher his sister's dignity for sport. The absolute silence from his side of the room was the final fatal stab to my heart. In that suffocating moment, surrounded by laughing strangers, I realized the brother I raised was dead, replaced by a hollow shell of a man I no longer recognized. The vicious, echoing laughter of the aristocratic crowd was still bouncing off the crystal chandeliers, drilling deep into my skull. It was a suffocating symphony of mockery. The fight completely drained out of my body. There was no grand stand to be made here, no righteous defense that could pierce through the thick armor of their wealth and cruelty. I made the silent, heavy decision to surrender. I would grab my son's hand, turn my back on this toxic fortress of lies, and walk out into the cold night air, severing my ties with my brother forever. I shifted my weight, preparing to push my heavy wooden chair back and flee, but my fingers grasped only empty air. Before I could even rise to my feet, Leo had smoothly slipped down from his seat. The movement was incredibly fast, yet eerily fluid. I expected to look down and see a terrified child crying and begging to go home. Instead, I stared at a profile carved from absolute ice. My 9-year-old boy was not weeping. He was not trembling. His small jaw was set tight, and his features were locked into a chilling, unfamiliar expression of pure, unwavering resolution. In his cheap dark blue suit, he looked like a tiny soldier marching onto a battlefield entirely composed of giants. Without a single word to me, Leo turned his back to our shadowy corner and stepped out into the blinding glare of the main aisle. He began to walk. His small black dress shoes hit the plush, deep red carpet with a steady, rhythmic determination. He was heading straight for the grand elevated stage where Chloe was still striking her victorious pose, the microphone dangling loosely from her manicured fingers. Panic, sharp and blinding, exploded in my chest. "Leo," I hissed, my voice a desperate, strangled whisper that barely escaped my throat. I lunged forward, stretching my bleeding hand out to grab the back of his jacket to pull him back into the safety of the shadows. But my muscles locked instantly. I was suddenly paralyzed, frozen solid by the sheer crushing weight of hundreds of pairs of eyes abruptly shifting their collective gaze. The room's attention snapped away from the glamorous bride and plummeted directly onto the tiny figure marching down the center aisle. The malicious buzzing whispers ignited instantly, spreading through the sea of tables like a rapid wildfire. "What on earth is that woman's son trying to do?" A woman draped in diamonds sneered from a nearby table. "Is the little rat going to beg for money?" A man in a bespoke tuxedo muttered, swirling his champagne glass. The atmosphere inside the grand ballroom transformed in a matter of seconds. It shifted from arrogant amusement to a thick, suffocating wave of hostility. The air became heavy, practically vibrating with a sudden dark threat. Every elite guest leaned forward like a pack of wolves smelling fresh blood, their cruel stares practically daring this poor child to make a fool of himself. Leo ignored them all. He did not flinch at the hateful whispers. He did not look left or right. He kept his wide brown eyes locked dead onto the towering floral arrangements decorating the podium. He reached the base of the massive stage and grabbed the heavy brass railing, hauling his small body up the carpeted stairs. A frantic man in a black headset, the wedding DJ, rushed forward from his equipment table. He stretched out a massive hand to block Leo's path, aggressively trying to shoo my son away like a stray dog. "Hey kid, get off the stage, you are ruining the program," the DJ growled. My heart slammed against my ribs. I finally forced my legs to move, preparing to scream, to run up there and shield my boy from their physical violence. But before I could take a single step, a voice broke through the tension. "Stop. Let the boy speak." It was Ethan. My brother had finally lifted his head from his silver dinner plate. His face was entirely devoid of color, painted in a sickly gray shade of pure guilt and agonizing internal conflict. For a fleeting, miraculous fraction of a second, the terrified little boy I used to protect had clawed his way to the surface of the man's hollow shell. Ethan raised a shaking hand, gesturing weakly toward the DJ to back away. The command was soft, but in that extremely tense, quiet room, it carried the weight of law. The DJ hesitated, looking at Chloe for confirmation, But Ethan's desperate glare held him in place. Leo did not wait for permission. He slipped past the massive man and stepped right up to the very center of the stage. The microphone stand was a towering, heavy silver structure designed for tall, confident adults, commanding the attention of the elite. Leo marched right up to it with the absolute certainty of a general taking his position on a hill. He had to rise up completely on the very tips of his toes, stretching his small frame to the absolute limit, just to bring his mouth close to the black steel mesh of the microphone. The grand ballroom was so brutally silent that I could clearly hear the soft squeak of his cheap leather shoes straining against the polished wooden stage floor. He did not tremble. He did not break a sweat. He took one slow, remarkably deep breath, expanding his small chest under his dark blue jacket. Then he tilted his head up and locked his wide, innocent brown eyes directly onto Chloe's face. He stared at her with a chilling, unblinking intensity that seemed entirely impossible for a boy of his age. When he finally spoke, his voice was beautifully clear, ringing with the high, sweet pitch of pure childhood. But the words he delivered carried the devastating, lethal force of an artillery shell. "Miss Chloe said my mom is a failure," Leo announced. His childish tone echoed flawlessly through the massive state of the art sound system, bouncing sharply off the crystal chandeliers and rolling over the sea of wealthy guests. "But my mom has never had to hide in a dark dressing room and cry because she was terrified the police were going to find her just like you did." The impact of those 28 words was instantaneous and catastrophic. The collective heartbeat of the entire grand ballroom seemed to stop completely. A solid silver fork slipping from a guest's hand and hitting a china plate sounded like a violent explosion in the heavy dead air. The absolute terrifying stillness that followed was unlike anything I had ever witnessed in my entire life. It was not the silence of polite anticipation. It was the paralyzed, breathless silence of several hundred high society predators suddenly realizing a massive trap had just snapped shut around them. Up on the brightly lit stage, the flawless aristocratic mask Chloe had spent years carefully gluing to her face cracked right down the middle. All the warm, blushing color drained out of her perfectly contoured cheeks in less than 3 seconds, leaving her skin a sickening, ghostly shade of chalk. The triumphant, venomous smile that had been plastered across her lips just moments ago froze, instantly morphing into a grotesque, twitching grimace. She stared down at my 9-year-old son as if a venomous reptile had just uncoiled itself right at her feet. "What?" Chloe stammered, her chest heaving wildly. Her voice was barely a rough, frantic whisper, completely stripped of its confident, theatrical boom. She lunged forward with sudden violence, her manicured fingers curling into desperate claws, attempting to violently snatch the microphone away from his small hands. But Leo was incredibly quick and perfectly composed. He simply took one smooth, calculated step backward, pulling the heavy microphone stand with him, easily dodging her aggressive swipe. Down in the shadowy corner of table 42, my heart was hammering against my ribs so violently, I thought my chest was going to physically crack open. My mind was completely blank, spinning wildly in a vortex of absolute total confusion. I had no earthly idea what my little boy was talking about. For the first 2 hours of the opulent reception, while I was sitting quietly and trying to make myself as invisible as possible, Leo had been wandering the empty, thick-carpeted hallways of the manor. He had told me he was playing a secret spy game, sneaking around corners and looking for imaginary villains. I had remembered adjusting his little tie, telling him to be a good boy and not bother anyone. He had nodded seriously, clutching a plastic silver star in his palm. I had assumed the absolute biggest risk of the night was him spilling fruit punch on his trousers. I never once suspected he was actively gathering devastating real-world intelligence. I had severely underestimated the quiet, invisible power of a child who goes entirely unnoticed by arrogant, self-absorbed adults. Leo did not wait for the stunned crowd to recover their senses. He maintained his firm, two-handed grip on the cold metal stand and leaned right back into the microphone. His voice remained perfectly even, carrying the calm, factual tone of a child simply reporting what he had seen on a morning cartoon show. A little while ago, I went down the hall into the big bridal dressing room because I dropped my shiny superhero badge, Leo explained plainly to the hundreds of frozen staring guests. I crawled all the way under the big vanity table to look for it, and while I was hiding under there in the dark, I heard Miss Chloe come inside. She locked the heavy door tight, and she started talking on her phone with a strange man. That single sentence was the final devastating nail in the coffin of Chloe's composure. The elegant poised heiress completely evaporated into thin air, entirely replaced by a cornered, panicking animal. The fake pearls sewn into her custom designer gown rattled loudly as her entire body began to physically shake with terror. If Leo had been making up a silly, childish story, she would have laughed it off with a patronizing pat on his head. Instead, she was reacting exactly like a hardened criminal who had just heard the cold click of metal handcuffs. "Shut up!" Chloe shrieked. It was not a word. It was a raw, deafening screech that tore through the microphone and blasted harshly through the towering speakers, making several distinguished guests physically flinch and cover their ears in pain. Her face contorted into a horrific mask of ugly naked terror. She completely abandoned all pretense of high society grace and began waving her arms wildly toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom. "Security! Get this lying little brat off my stage right this instant! Guards, drag him out of here!" she bellowed, her voice cracking into a hysterical shrill pitch that echoed frantically across the room, completely shattering the very last illusion of her manufactured perfection. "Security!" Chloe screamed. The single word ripped out of her throat with the raw, scraping desperation of a trapped rat. But the 6 heavily muscled men in black suits, standing guard by the towering mahogany doors, did not move a single inch. They crossed their arms and stayed completely frozen against the walls. Chloe's hysterical, unhinged meltdown was the absolute worst tactical error she could have possibly made in this specific room. In a grand ballroom entirely populated by ruthless corporate sharks, cynical politicians, and vicious socialites, raw panic was the universal scent of profound, undeniable guilt. The hundreds of aristocrats who had been sneering at me just 20 minutes ago now leaned forward in their plush velvet chairs, utterly mesmerized by the unfolding disaster. Nobody stepped forward to protect the bride. Nobody moved to silence the child. The suffocating tension stretched tighter and tighter, vibrating like a thick steel cable about to snap violently under immense pressure. The onlookers were desperate to hear exactly what the 9-year-old boy would say next. Leo didn't so much as blink at the screaming woman looming menacingly over him. Moving with an agonizing, chilling deliberation, he slipped his tiny hand deep into the left breast pocket of his navy jacket. When he withdrew it, his small fingers were clamped tightly around a thick, bulky block of black plastic. It was a burner phone, the exact kind of cheap disposable device meant to be used and thrown away. Untraceable prepaid device that criminals bought with dirty cash to conduct their filthy business and immediately toss into the nearest garbage dumpster. Chloe had obviously assumed she had buried the device safely at the bottom of a trash bin inside the massive bridal suite, completely unaware that a little boy playing a secret spy game would dig it out as a shiny, mysterious prize. She told the man on the phone, the man named Marcus, that this entire wedding was just a really boring play, Leo stated firmly. His bright, clear voice projected flawlessly over the massive speakers, completely dominating the deafening silence of the room. He was reciting the terrifying information, perfectly utilizing the razor-sharp photographic memory that only a highly observant child possessed. Down at table 42, the blood completely rushed out of my head, leaving me dizzy and sick with a sudden violent realization. The name dropped into my brain like a heavy block of solid concrete. Marcus. Out of the billions of men on this planet, that specific name triggered a blinding flash of sheer dread right behind my eyes. Marcus was the former executive director at EtherCore Dynamics. He was the very same arrogant, tyrannical boss who had been forcefully escorted out of our office building by armed police officers exactly 2 years ago for orchestrating a massive multi-million-dollar corporate embezzlement scheme. I knew this terrifying fact because I was the exact low-level administrative assistant who had accidentally found his hidden folder of forged invoices and handed them straight over to the internal audit department. I still vividly remembered the day he was arrested. Marcus had stopped right in front of my tiny cubicle while the police shoved him toward the elevator. He had looked directly into my eyes, his face twisted in pure hatred, and silently mouthed a vow to completely destroy my life. Suddenly, the impossible, jagged puzzle pieces slammed together with sickening, bone-crushing force. Chloe was not a random wealthy heiress who had miraculously fallen in love with my naive younger brother. She was a highly calculated weapon. She was a guided missile pointed directly at Ethan, designed entirely by a vengeful, disgraced corporate criminal to ruin the absolute only piece of family I had left in the world. Up on the brightly lit stage, Chloe realized her entire empire of lies was crumbling into dust. She lunged forward with brutal force, her sharp, manicured claws raking wildly through the empty air as she tried to snatch the device away. But she was much too slow. Leo's tiny thumb had already found the play button. He pressed it down hard, firmly holding the bottom speaker of the cheap black phone directly against the steel mesh of the microphone. For one agonizing, heart-stopping second, a burst of harsh electronic static hissed through the grand ballroom. Then a voice cut through the heavy air. It was not the sweet, cultured, aristocratic tone Chloe had used to viciously mock me just a few moments earlier. It was a cold, metallic, utterly ruthless voice dripping with pure greed and absolute disgust. It was undeniably her voice. "Relax, Marcus. The idiot is completely under my thumb." The recorded voice of Chloe echoed off the vaulted ceilings, her cruel words falling like toxic acid rain over the completely stunned crowd. "The reception is going perfectly. His pathetic mother and that miserable sister of his are entirely distracted fighting each other exactly as we planned. Nobody suspects a single thing." A collective horrified gasp tore through the sea of wealthy guests. Up at the VIP table, my brother Ethan finally stood up, his heavy dining chair crashing violently backward onto the polished marble floor. His face was twisted into a grotesque mask of pure agony. His eyes were wide open, locked onto his beautiful bride, as if she had just transformed into a rotting, terrifying monster right in front of him. The recording continued to play, offering absolutely no mercy whatsoever. "Tomorrow morning, at exactly 9 o'clock, Ethan will sign the final partnership documents." Chloe's recorded voice sneered through the towering speakers, completely devoid of any human warmth or affection. "He honestly thinks it is a joint bank account for our new luxury house, but the paperwork is entirely rigged. It legally mortgages 100% of his new technology startup directly to our offshore holding company. By the time the bank fully processes the ink at noon, we will completely liquidate every single asset he owns. I am booking the first-class tickets right now. We will be drinking expensive champagne in a non-extradition country before the stupid boy even realizes his entire life is completely gone." The harsh metallic click of the audio recording ending echoed like a gunshot through the sprawling expanse of Silverbell Manor. The silence that instantly descended upon the grand ballroom was no longer filled with polite shock. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of total annihilation. The glittering, invincible mask of the aristocratic heiress did not just slip. It violently exploded into a million jagged pieces right before the judging eyes of the city's most powerful elites. Chloe completely snapped. Her carefully constructed sanity shattered in real time. Emitting a guttural, feral shriek that sounded absolutely demonic, she lunged aggressively across the stage. Her fingers curled into vicious claws, aiming directly for Leo's face, desperate to rip the black plastic phone from his tiny grip. But she never even came close to touching him. I did not make a conscious decision to move. Pure, blinding maternal instinct hijacked my entire nervous system. I cleared the distance from table 42 to the towering stage with the explosive speed of a cornered lioness. My cheap high heels slammed against the polished wood as I launched my body directly into her path. I slammed my shoulder brutally into Chloe's chest. The impact lifted her completely off her feet. She crashed backward with a sickening thud, her head bouncing sharply against the wooden floorboards. The custom designer wedding gown ripped down the side, the expensive pearls scattering like cheap marbles across the stage. I stood over her, my breathing ragged, firmly positioning my body as an impenetrable absolute shield in front of my 9-year-old son. To my right, Ethan stood entirely paralyzed. He looked like a hollow statue suddenly struck by lightning. In his trembling right hand, he held the decorative ceremonial marriage certificate they were scheduled to sign publicly at the end of the night. His fingers slowly went numb, and the thick parchment paper slipped from his grasp, floating pathetically to the floor to land right next to Chloe's ruined veil. The horrifying truth crashed down on him with the weight of a collapsing skyscraper. The flawless goddess he had worshipped, the woman for whom he had mercilessly discarded his own flesh and blood, was nothing but a ruthless, calculating con artist. And the sister he had openly allowed to be humiliated was the only innocent person left in his life. Down in the audience, the brutal mechanics of high society turned against my mother with terrifying speed. Eleanor, whose face was completely drained of all color, desperately tried to salvage the catastrophic situation. She forced a sickeningly fake, trembling smile onto her pale lips and turned to the wealthy socialites sitting at her table, attempting to laugh the entire situation off as a bizarre theatrical prank. But the aristocrats she had so desperately tried to impress now looked at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. A prominent senator's wife visibly recoiled, pulling her expensive fur shawl tightly around her shoulders as if my mother carried a deadly, infectious disease. Eleanor shrank down into her chair, utterly destroyed by the very same shallow elitism she had weaponized against me. Ethan finally found his voice. It was a broken, raspy croak that barely resembled my brother. He pulled his cell phone from his tailored tuxedo pocket. "This wedding is entirely canceled," he announced, his voice trembling with a mixture of profound grief and boiling rage. "I am calling the police right now. You are going to prison for attempted corporate fraud and extortion." Chloe began to thrash wildly on the floor, weeping and screaming pathetic, chaotic excuses, completely destroying the very last remnants of her elegant facade. But nobody was listening to her anymore. The mighty empire of lies had burned to the ground. Ethan slowly turned his head toward me. His eyes were wide, completely filled with agonizing regret and desperate unspoken apologies. He took one hesitant step forward, reaching out a shaking hand as if begging me to comfort him, to fix the devastating mess he had created, exactly like I always did when we were children. But I felt absolutely nothing. The deep, agonizing well of tears I had been desperately fighting to hold back all evening had completely dried up. My heart was cold, steady, and finally at peace. I looked calmly into the broken, shattered eyes of the brother I had once loved more than my own life. Then I shifted my gaze to the pathetic, shrinking figure of my mother hiding in the audience. I reached down and gently wrapped my hand around Leo's small, warm fingers. I pulled him close to my side. "I spent my entire youth protecting you," I said to Ethan, my voice ringing out with a calm, undeniable authority that sliced through the chaotic weeping of his fraudulent bride. "But starting today, the only man I need to protect is holding my hand right now." I did not wait for his response. I turned my back on the wreckage. Holding my son's hand tightly, I walked slowly and deliberately down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. We walked directly past the staring politicians, the whispering corporate executives, and the ruined remnants of my toxic family. We pushed through the massive, heavy oak doors of Silverbell Manor and stepped out into the crisp, clean night air, our heads held incredibly high, leaving them all behind to choke on the bitter ashes of the hell they built for themselves. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Vivian Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.